Hello, AP Comparative. This is Andrew Canine broadcasting from Studio Room to See, where there's always room to see how countries compare, and there's always room to hear from guest speakers. And man, do we have a great guest speaker today from the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. So I want to get into Unit 5 so that we can hear from our guest speaker. I'm going to give you a tip-off. He teaches corporate finance, but he has had a role as a financier for the Royal Bank of India, not the Royal Bank of India, the Reserve Bank of India, and the chief economist of the IMF, which all connects to big concepts that you can understand and put into argument essays on your AP Comparative Day on May 22nd. Yes, we know that this exam is focused on units 1, 2, and 3. We know that content that's exclusive to Unit 5 isn't fair game, but we also know that there are some concepts in Unit 1 and 3 particularly that relates to some core examples and knowledge from Unit 5 that can really be to your benefit if you try to master those concepts. So we're going to get into those concepts here with Unit 5 as we look at economic globalization, political and economic change. I'm Andrew Canane. You don't care about that. Let's get right into the content. Make sure you download the course description. If you have not done that, that's where I use my codes. The different topics comes from the College Board course description. You can download my materials at citizenu.org. It's Mr. Larson put this together for the two teachers. Go through that US government material, but then go to Comparative Corner and download my supplemental notes about all 5 units, includes glossaries for all 5 units. And if you go on that citizenu.org, I've got the FRQs, every FRQ I've written through Unit 3 and yesterday's Unit 4 review and today's Unit 5. I put them on CitizenU in Comparative Corner so you can practice and you can see some of the ways that I write as in my models. Visit the AP website for updates and specifics about this exam and any other AP exams you might be taking. Got to get to those shout outs. If you have a teacher or classmates you want to shout out to, just a few days left, get those shout outs to hashtag APCompGov 2020. Alex Dewey Benrocks back onto the hashtag with a very relevant and pertinent example. Yesterday, we were talking about social movements, movements by citizens in our various case countries. Put a terrific example of a social movement in Nigeria of MOSOP, the movement of the survival of the Ogoni people in Nigeria. Alex Dewey, if you listen to today's guest speaker, he doesn't specifically reference Nigeria, but he certainly talks about local peoples and local communities and how markets in the state have left communities behind in some circumstances. And certainly we know that the movement you talk about, the MOSOP in Nigeria, is part of that community response when they feel like the state, the government, and the markets are ignoring communities. So a really relevant example for today's guest speaker. And then Bryn is all over Unit 5 asking a really great question. What's fair game from Unit 5? Considering that the test is focused on Units 1, 2, and 3, it's a terrific question that I want to get into because that's really what today is about, plus some expert insights from our guest speaker. Here is my preview of, I have 2 free responses for Unit 5's review. Today's a little bit different. Our guest speaker, that you're going to hear from him for about 35 minutes. And as I interviewed him, it's pre-recorded. And as I interviewed him, I realized, man, his insights, Dr. Rajan's insights, could be a great argument essay. So I actually wrote his insights up as an argument essay. Here's what it is. Assess the relationship between the decentralization of power and GDP growth rate. Decentralization of power and GDP growth rate are really fair game concepts from Units 1 and 3, plus neoliberalism, political ideology referenced in Unit 3. These are all fair game concepts from Unit 1 and 3 that if you have an understanding of concepts and specific knowledge from Unit 5, you're going to be much more capable of rocking this argument essay if you were to see an argument essay that was about these concepts. And so listen to our guest speaker, his answer, and there's a nice chunk in his answer that really answers this question. I'm not going to show you my model answer today. That's a little bit different. Usually I show you at the end in the last 10 minutes a model. I have put my models on citizenu.org in that comparative corner so you can see them, you can read them yourself, but I want to see if you can answer this question. See if you can answer it now and how much you would know about it now with country-specific examples. I'll tip you off. The countries that I picked for this are Mexico, China, and the United Kingdom. And so you got to speak to two of those countries, or you can speak to one of those countries in two different ways, remember, for the argument essay. But you got to incorporate neoliberalism so you can think about how you would answer this question, particularly as you listen to our guest speaker, because he's going to give you a tip-off, if you're paying attention, that you could really rock this question. And again, we're going to hear from our guest speaker, Dr. Rajan, in just a moment. He wrote a book that was out last year called The Third Pillar, How Markets and the State Leave Community Behind. Really prestigious resume. He teaches at one of the top business schools in the world, but he has real life examples, real life experiences with as the chair of India's Reserve Bank and with supranational organization, the International Monetary Fund. And you're going to hear from him, and it's really helpful. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to show you this. This is the thesis that I wrote after listening to Dr. Rajan speak. I don't want you to see that, but you can read the thesis that I wrote based on his speech, and you can read my model answers again at citizenu.org in the comparative corner, because I probably won't have time to get to that material today. We are looking at Unit 5. Tomorrow we're going to be reviewing 1, then Unit 2, then Unit 3, and then it's prep week. And I'm going to get into, here is what I think, and this is just my insights as I read the AP comparative course description. When I read into Unit 5, which it really addresses political and economic change, big concepts like economic globalism, examples of that, constraints on state power when it comes to the economy. So when I think about those big concepts from Unit 5, I go back into Units 1 and 3 particularly and see different concepts that Unit 5 can connect back to. So this is where you can go back and look at sovereignty from topic 1.2 and discrimination based on gender or religious differences. There's a topic in Unit 5 that talks particularly about population and gender discrimination. Well, that's something that was mentioned back in topic 1.10. And so in particular with Iran and gender discrimination that we see in Nigeria as it pertains to Sharia law in the north, with the gender quotas that we've talked about in Mexican politics. Some of that is fair game. It should say it's helpful to know that, to understand about gender discrimination from topic 1.10. Neoliberalism is one of those overarching concepts that deals with so much with supranational organizations and free trade policies like the World Trade Organization and challenges to sovereignty. Another ideology you should know from Unit 3 is socialism. And then there's the welfare state. And then, of course, there's nationalization in the example that's given in the course description of Russia nationalizing broadcast, also Russia nationalizing oil and other commodities under Putin's administration. So those are topics from Units 1 and 3 that I think can connect to content examples from Unit 5. So when you read through Unit 5, that course description, I really invite you to do that. Be thinking about these 6 different concepts from Units 1 and 3 and the connections you can make. Just in terms of, as I go through Unit 5 and look at the key vocabulary that I see in the course description, certainly economic globalization, MNCs, multinational corporations, the special economic zones in China, privatization, this movement that we saw, particularly examples in the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher and in China under Deng Xiaoping, to reduce the government control of industries and let the free market control. Contrasting that with nationalization, for instance, that we've seen in Russia with Putin's controlling of broadcast media and the Russian central government control of the oil industry in Russia in the last 20 years. The good news is, I know I'm racing through this. If you go back to my lessons on 5.1, 5.2, and 5.3, I cover most of these concepts much more in depth with country-specific examples than I'm going to do today. So if you're a bit panicked and this is one of the more recent lessons you've been viewing, don't worry about it. Go back to the YouTube lessons 5.1, 5.2, and 5.3. You're going to see most of these key concepts from Unit 5 covered in those lessons. So foreign direct investment is a topic that I taught about earlier and gave actually an example of some FRQ writing connected with foreign direct investment. Environmental degradation connected to the growth of economic globalization is in Unit 5. International organizations such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and that contrasts sometimes with supranational organizations such as the European Union, which has control over trade policy, or the World Trade Organization that has control over trade policy with more of those member countries, or the West African example of a supranational organization of ECOWAS that Nigeria is a member of. So again, International Monetary Fund, you'll hear a little bit more about that from our guest speaker, Dr. Rajan. Typically, when a member country is in the International Monetary Fund as a recipient of aid, as a recipient of money in an emergency situation, typically those countries that are trying to receive that emergency aid or that funding typically have to accept what's called structural adjustment programs. So that's some degree of lowering tariffs to allow more free trade, to allow more imports, some degree of cutting back budgets, or what we call austerity cuts to budgets, which reduces a government's spending, and they're spending specifically on trying to help domestic industries. And so that's what we call structural adjustment programs, which typically is a condition of receiving aid. So if a country is trying to receive aid from the IMF, that's where the IMF could be considered as a supranational organization, because a supranational organization controls policy to some degree of member countries. And if you're receiving money from the IMF, you have to play by some of the IMF's rules, including some degree of structural adjustment programs. Tariffs we've talked about before in terms of a government regulation regarding international trade. Subsidies actually connects also with this ISI from Unit 5. And this is where a country that's trying to protect their domestic industries might increase tariffs on outside products, and they might increase subsidies toward domestic industries as a way of protecting those domestic industries at home from that global competition. So that's what we see in more countries that are using more government regulation to protect industry rather than neoliberal reforms, which is intended to reduce government regulations of industries. And like I said before, austerity measures is typically a condition of receiving aid from banks, international banks like the International Monetary Fund. And like I mentioned before, particularly as it relates to Iran and Mexico and Nigeria, that topic of civil rights for women with gender equity. So those are some of the key concepts from Unit 5. If you have other specific, country-specific examples of globalization, please use the hashtag. Plenty to choose from, particularly in this era of governmental responses and economic responses to coronavirus. I do want to play for you this Q&A, this discussion with our guest today, Dr. Rajan. So I'm going to share this clip and invite you to listen, and particularly listen to Dr. Rajan as it goes, as he speaks particularly to the idea of the decentralization of power. I think you're going to get some country-specific examples for that argument essay. So I'm going to turn on the clip of Dr. Rajan now. All right, so we have an incredible opportunity to have a guest speaker who is a master at the. I'm going to make sure I have shared the sound. Yep, okay, good. And let's do this again, take 2. Concepts particularly found in Unit 5 of AP Comparative Government about economic globalization and neoliberalism. And he has a book that was published last year. I have to admit, this has been my quarantine lockdown reading, and it has been so good. I love teaching AP Comparative Government. It's a great class to teach. It's also a lifestyle. So my leisure reading has been reading Dr. Rajan's book called The Third Pillar. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Rajan. I'm going to show you, I'm going to share my screen here and show you his book. And if you're a teacher of comparative government, if you're a student, especially if you're a senior heading off to university, especially if you're studying, if you're interested in economics and politics, and you're interested in just learning from a master teacher, someone who has seen how neoliberalism and how politics works with markets, I really encourage you to pick up The Third Pillar, How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind by Dr. Raghu Rajan. And I'm going to introduce him. Dr. Rajan has been at the University of Chicago, about 60 miles south of me, since 1991, where he teaches at the Booth School, that's part of the University of Chicago. But he was also the governor of India's Reserve Bank. And so if you know your American politics, this is the equivalent of the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board for India. And he has firsthand experience working with the International Monetary Fund as the chief economist for the IMF from 2003 and 2006. And I've recently learned has been named by the IMF to be part of their external advisory group recommending policies from the IMF related to coronavirus. We're going to talk to him about that as well at the end of this discussion about his book, The Third Pillar. Dr. Rajan, thank you very much for joining us. It's a special treat for these, for myself and for these students of political science. As I'm reading your book, I think in advanced placement, our students have taken AP Euro. As they read your book, they're reading about your development of the history of the state and its relationship to the market. We have AP Human Geography students who are taking this course now. You talk about the size of cities and the locations of cities mattering as they compete globally. Of course, you have a fair share of US politics in there, particularly with the rise of skepticism about neoliberal and free trade policies, particularly in the 2016 election. Of course, macro and micro. Before you talk about the book, this is such a broad book, a look at different social sciences. What is your educational background that got you interested not just in economics, but this whole broader look at social sciences?
Well, I guess my training is in finance and economics, but I work in a business school where you bump into psychologists, behavioral scientists, sociologists all the time. And of course, you read, because after all, the problems in the economy and the problems in business don't belong to one discipline. You have to approach it from different areas. So I have to say, writing this book was an education in its own right. I had to read extensively. And of course, in some areas, you are a beginner. In other areas, because you know deeply in your own subject, you can come up with some views which are fresh. So it's a little bit of taking, it's a little bit of giving. That's what academia is all about.
Now, in addition to these prominent roles you've had in India and with the IMF, you've been a longtime teacher. You teach at one of the most prestigious business schools in the world. A lot of our students are heading off to be undergraduate students next year. They're expected to know about concepts like neoliberalism, economic globalization, supranational organizations like the IMF, the role of the supranational organizations and the relationship with sovereignty. What would you say that an incoming undergraduate student who's studying political science, comparative political science, or economics, what would you say are the most important ways to understand those concepts for a young student?
Well, I mean, partly nowadays you get a great education by reading the newspapers. There's so much going on, and there's so much to revisit. I mean, both in terms of what needs to change, but also how it came about. For instance, when you talk about the trade disputes, certainly you want to know how the current trading structure was put together. And it turns out the United States had a huge role to play post-World War II in putting together the structure of what became known as New World Order. And today it's breaking apart. So you first have to understand why it came together, why it's breaking apart, and then speculate on what can replace it. So I think the newspapers are a great education, but there are so many books that both today and in the past that go into much of this. And once you get into a subject, it's hard to stop reading. There's so much that you can take in. And it helps every once in a while to stop reading and see, can I write an essay on this? Because often when you write, you find that the concepts become much clearer. You're forced to make your concepts more precise. What was fuzzy earlier becomes more precise. So try writing every once in a while.
And of course, this is not your first book, and this is not your first attempt at writing. And we're not asking students to write a book, but you're right. I mean, it's to understand economics and political sciences, to read current events and to understand those concepts. But the great thing about this particular course and the exam that students are taking in May is they're going to be challenged to make connections between these different concepts. And certainly knowing about current events is going to be really helpful. I couldn't help but to notice in your book, the third pillar, of course, the first two pillars are the state and the market. And again, an AP European history teacher or an AP European history student, you're really going to want to get in there and read Dr. Rajan's take on the development of the state and its relationship with the market. That third pillar, that the book is really the core piece of that, is the role of community. And the idea that these first two pillars, the state and the market, have grown so much in recent decades, particularly in the world of economic globalization, that has in some cases come at the expense of community. In AP Comparative Government, we don't talk about local government that much. There's 6 core countries that students have to know, including China and Russia, Nigeria and Mexico, United Kingdom, Iran. We don't look at local government, but we look a lot at civil society. Can you tell the students what you found about the role of civil society as you were writing this book, as you've done your studies, in terms of how vital civil society groups are to the community that you speak to as the third pillar?
Sure. I mean, think let's start with markets. I mean, markets have been here for a long time. It's about exchange. It's about, comparative advantage. Some people can do something better than others. The person who knows how to make boots becomes a cobbler, and in return, he gives the person who can teach some shoes, while the person who can teach gives him lessons in philosophy. That's how the market system works, and they don't really exchange lessons for boots. What they do is exchange money. And so you get a market economy mediated by money. Any market requires governance. And the wider the area of governance, the larger the market can be, and the more people can specialize within that market, right? And therefore, the more efficient the market becomes. So markets have a tendency to expand either directly because they expand within a political territory, or because different political territories trade with each other. But the general tendency, and that's what I talk about in this book, is for markets to grow and for government to grow with it. Often people think of the two as being opposed to each other. In general, you see the more market-oriented societies are, the bigger the government they have. Because the government not only provides the governance, but it also provides a safety net, something we've become much more aware of during this period of coronavirus, that the more volatile the markets, the more you need the state to provide things like healthcare, provide unemployment insurance, provide the kind of packages to small and medium enterprises that we're seeing coming out from the government today in the face of coronavirus. However, what is missing in all this is civil society, the community. And why is that important? That's important because neither the market nor the government can take care of everything. When you are a child growing up, there's lots of activity that goes on, which is mediated neither by the market nor by the government. Think of growing up within your family, the kind of services that your parents, your siblings provide for you. That's not mediated on the basis of a market exchange. It's also not a right that you have as a result of being a citizen of the country. It's something voluntary. It's based on the community you grew up in. And similarly, what your neighbors do, and what the local, for example, NGO, something like, say, the Young Men's Christian Association, or the Boy Scouts, or the Girl Scouts. Those are kinds of organizations that fill in the holes that are left when the government or the markets can't fill them in. And so they provide a lot of value in society. Let's take some concrete examples. In your school, there's a Parent-Teachers Association, which is a voluntary organization. But if you're a successful school, it almost surely is partly based on the value the parents and the Parent-Teacher Association provides, because the parents get engaged, they work with the teachers in providing a better environment. You have school trips to, for example, firms where parents work, and they welcome kids into that school, into that firm. You have museum trips sometimes because parents work in the museum, and you have hospital trips. The learning experience is much richer when you have active collaboration between parents and teachers and the community. That's an example of a voluntary organization, but there are so many organizations apart from local government which are voluntary, which help fill in the holes. Charitable organizations which are very active today, food banks, Salvation Army, places like that, which essentially help a community stay together and survive through difficult times.
That's an incredible description. Those are the organizations that fill in the holes between the gaps of the state and the market. A lot of your argument in terms of trying to resurrect and rebuild that third pillar of communities, you speak to what you call inclusive localism. How does civil society, how do those local governments, can you give students an idea of what you mean by inclusive localism?
Yeah. One of the problems with this really expanded market and the governance that expands with it is a lot of decisions are taken out of the locality and taken at a much higher level. And the reason for that is a desire for uniformity. Firms like to see the same kinds of rules and regulations wherever they go. They have to adapt less if those rules are similar. And therefore, they want that kind of uniformity. And there are reasons sometimes it makes sense. Think about emission requirements for cars. You want a nationwide emission requirement rather than the emission requirement to change every time you cross a district border and enter a new county or a new district. So that's very important. Uniformity there might make sense. But what this tends to do is take too many decisions, partly because of this requirement of uniformity, partly because when you have a nation which is governed centrally, there's a temptation to take powers up. Oh, those locals can't be trusted. Oh, those locals are corrupt. Oh, we need some uniformity here regardless, because otherwise, you will get you'll get bad consequences. So net result is many decisions get elevated and too little is left in the locality. Too much is determined elsewhere. And my argument in the book, in part, is that some of our concerns about globalization are that we feel disempowered. We have very little to say because too many decisions have been taken away, taken to the national capital and from the national capital internationally. Take, for example, this the vote against against staying within the European Union in Britain, also known as Brexit. Why did people vote for Brexit? In part, the theme was take back control. People wanted to take back control from the European Union. Too many decisions were made in Brussels, and they felt they had little say over them. But in fact, it was not just the view that it was taken in Brussels, it was the view that too many decisions were even taken in London. And they wanted the decisions to be taken locally, not far away. And I think what we need to do to make globalization work is make sure that while we have the free flow of goods and services, that many decisions should be taken locally. You should have a lot more power to affect your future than we have today. And it is possible to have both, to have the free flow of goods and services while you have more local decisions. Decisions, for example, over what your primary school teaches, made between parents and teachers sitting together and deciding what needs to be done. Of course, at some level, you need a national curriculum. It doesn't have to start with primary school. So there could be many more local decisions. And that's what I mean by localism. The fear in this country is that localism means racism. Localism means exclusion. Because all too often, local decisions were a way of disregarding, national norms on inclusion. I want to be separate and unequal, therefore I'm going to be local. And that's where I say it doesn't need to be that way. You can have localism, but with inclusion, with a sense of acceptance of a wide variety of views and a wide variety of people, but together as a community, you make decisions for yourself as a community.
So
and that includes, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that, certainly two of the topics, concepts that students have to know in comparative government is the difference between a federal system and a unitary system that has more central decision-making. Since the United Kingdom is one of the countries they have to know, certainly they have to know about Brexit, but it sounds like you're saying that Brexit, another example, is just one more example from the United Kingdom of essentially devolution, because for the last better part of 25 years, the central government has been devolving powers to the Scottish regional government or Wales. Could that be an example of that localism that you speak to, the other form of devolution in the United Kingdom?
Absolutely. So what happened, which is interesting, that the Thatcherian Revolution was also a revolution of concentration of power. Thatcher didn't believe so much in the community. And so a lot more power was taken away, which seems strange because when you accept the power of markets, you're sort of talking about decentralization.
Right.
But you accept the power of markets and then you centralize. That's more the point I was making, that they tend to go together, centralization of government and the spread of markets. And the ideal to me would be to let the markets flow, but decentralize political decisions. And that's what, to some extent, the United Kingdom has been trying, sometimes forced, sometimes it's policy. For example, the Conservative government in 2010, Cameron, wanted to create what he called, I think, the big society, and wanted to devolve power to the localities in a much bigger way. Didn't work out that much because they soon felt they didn't have enough money to do it, and so it got put on the back burner. But what you see now with the new Conservative government of Boris Johnson is an attempt to push at least more activity, if not power, to some of the big cities, as well as further to the northeast, to the northern regions, which didn't have power. And so that kind of devolution is something that a number of countries are thinking of. Let's push power back. And of course, there's enormous resistance to that from the existing establishment because it means a loss of power. So it needs a new political impetus coming from elections and a new set of people coming in. It's something that's talked a lot about in the United States. The United States always had a federal structure with a fair amount of decentralization. And you can see it play out today with the fight about who's going to determine whether what the pace of opening after the first fight against the coronavirus has proved successful. When are we going to open? Who's going to decide? We can see President Trump saying from Washington, it's my decision, and the state governors saying it's their decision. But really, this is, in some sense, very healthy, because we need powers to be, over time, differentiated and decentralized. There are some powers which need to be centralized. And here what we have is a debate about which exactly the power to reopen is. Is it something that needs national coordination, or is it something that has to be based on the conditions of each area? New York has much higher degrees of infection than, for example, perhaps North Dakota. And therefore, the decision on when to open may be different. And perhaps it should be decentralized rather than a common national decision.
So one of the countries, in addition to the United Kingdom, students have to know is China. And I know that in terms of localism, this is a global problem that every country has to look at. But would a country like China, with such a strong centralized state and obviously such dedication to market growth, but because they're such a unitary state, is that a particular struggle in China? How does this powerful centralized government find ways to empower local communities?
It's a great question. And strangely, they managed to have the best of both in a sense, right? That without local democracy, they did still manage to empower local government by sending functionaries of the Communist Party there, but with the notion that their promotion depended on how well they grew the locality. So they were given effectively an equity stake in the growth of the local community and told, do your best, and based on how you do, we will promote you. So they were fierce in trying to get, the most economic activity into their communities, into their localities as they could. Now, some of this went overboard in the sense that some of these officials, in order to prompt growth, built enormous developments, which now we see are not viable commercially. And as a result, there's a big bad debt problem building up in China that they have to deal with. But this empowering of local government officials ensured that the local government official could take decisions, which in a sense created an entirely different ecosystem locally than what the national government envisaged. And so this local official could bend whatever rules, say these rules don't apply. So for a very regimented country, it actually had a very flexible system locally because these guys could make those decisions. Now, what is happening over the last few years is that kind of decentralization, that kind of localism is reverting as President Xi is trying to concentrate more power centrally. And therefore, to my mind, this is going to harm China because it's not going to have that flexibility it had in the past.
So interesting. Another concept or set of concepts that students have to know, they have to know political ideologies. Neoliberalism, populism, socialism, individualism. And yet your book seems to weave in between a lot of different ideologies. What was the role? What were you thinking in terms of political ideology? Certainly you talk about politics, you talk about ideologies. What were you thinking about ideology as you crafted the book?
Well, I'm fundamentally a social liberal in the American sense, and a economic liberal in the British sense. Right. So I want people to have the best chance to succeed, and it is my view that the state and the community provide them that early support. I don't think people are tossed out into the open to struggle in the fight for life, the survival of the fittest, just like that. I think in a civilized society, we take care of them when they're young, help them learn, help them get good values, so that when they enter the market, they're on a level playing field. That to me is the ideal. And then I think on the economic front, that the market goes up and down, has huge aberrations, but if reasonably well regulated, competition is probably the most productive force known to mankind. Problem is many markets aren't particularly competitive, don't give many people a chance, tend to be monopolized. That's the wrong kind of market. And it seems to me we have to work on making that market more accessible. So if there's a word that is common to both my economic and my social system, it's access. We need access for all. And a competitive market does that, and a accepting inclusive localism, but inclusive national government also offers access to people, to the resources and the capability building that they absolutely need to become participants in the market.
And on that note of access, AP comparative students have to know about Gini, and they have to be able to analyze data about income inequality. Key aspects of your book are all about inequities between communities, inequities within communities. What should a young political scientist or economist know about inequities that they're not going to be able to see just in data?
Well, certainly the Gini coefficient measures the extent to which income or wealth is concentrated, right? The Gini coefficient is 1 if it all goes to one person, and it is 0 if it's evenly distributed across the economy. We can talk about graphs and so on, which enable you to visualize the Gini coefficient. But the more important thing is inequality doesn't just exist in those outcomes. Often those outcomes are a result of inequality which has been entrenched far before that. And much of the book is about saying that in this world where capabilities, skills have become so much more important, your access to a good, fulfilling, rich childhood, and then your access to good schooling, good teachers, engaged teachers, interested teachers, they make all the difference in your life. And when you don't have access, your life is very different. And so the inequality in access right from the beginning creates the inequality later on. It is all very well for somebody to say, oh, we have a competitive market, and you can come in here and you can make money or lose money. Nobody's stopping you from doing it. But yes, do we all enter the market on a level playing field? And if you don't have access up front, you don't enter on a level playing field. And that's really the problem in our societies today. Too many people feel left behind. Right. Because they didn't get that access in the first place.
Speaking of left behind, I can't leave this interview without asking for your insights into how coronavirus will affect economies, affect societies. You speak throughout the book about different natural catastrophes, economic catastrophes, having big societal changes. What are some of your outlooks in terms of indicators that students should be paying attention to?
That's a great question, because to some extent this book was about the fault lines created by technological change. And I talk in the book about two great sources of change in society. One is technological change, and the other is calamity, whether it is a calamity like the Black Death, or calamity like the coronavirus. Now, we still don't know how bad this can get. It's bad enough as it is in the tragedy of the large number of people who've died or who've been severely impaired by the virus. But it's also a wake-up call for us, because it accentuates the fault lines that already exist in society. Many of us can continue doing our work, as a professor, I can still stay in my room and do 90% of the work I usually do. I mean, sitting in the classroom and teaching, of course, is more fun than sitting on Zoom. But I can get to 90% in a safe environment. That Uber driver either has no work or has to go out in an unsafe environment in order to solicit work at this time. And that is an example of the divide. We can see that every day where you have frontline workers in grocery stores, in hospitals. Some of them have a choice, some of them don't. And the question is, what's the line that divides us and them? Often it is a stronger education. I'm not talking about the medical workers, but I'm talking about the grocery store assistants and the people out patrolling the streets and so on. They're doing a fantastic job, a very necessary job. But we must remember that often the difference between having a safe job and a job on the front line is what resources you had access to earlier. And so I think the combination of technological change, which has made many of those middle class, high-paying jobs out of reach without a strong education, that's one of the big factors in technological change. Combined with the fact the coronavirus, which highlights the costs, not just in lower incomes, but now even in danger to life and limb, from not having those kinds of protections, not having that kind of safety net, which a good job and a good income creates. I think that was going to increase the pressure for reform. Now, my worry after the global financial crisis, we were focused too much on let's ease monetary policy, let's spend more fiscally, without thinking, what do we need to spend on? Who do we need whose lives do we need to improve? And I think we're going to ask that question much more strongly after the coronavirus when we take stock of what happened. And I think it's useful to combine the two big forces together and say, how do we deal with the effects of technological change, of automation, of globalization, knowing that, a pandemic like the coronavirus highlights the fault lines that were already existing.
Oh boy, so that was so good. And I felt so bad because I had talked to Dr. Rajan about only a 15-minute interview and I couldn't stop asking questions. His responses were so interesting. And again, it's that response that I put into this argument essay on assess the relationship between decentralization of power and GDP growth rate, connecting that to neoliberalism. Go to citizenu.org, go to Comparative Corner, go to, I have two questions on today's topic, Unit 5. Go to the more practice and you're going to see those Unit 4 and Unit 5 FRQ samples with my model writing. But thank you for tuning in. I hope you got some insights from Dr. Rajan about his work with the IMF, about the role of communities, the relationship with the state and the market, some really interesting thoughts about the impact of coronavirus and government responses. If you have suggestions for tomorrow, we're going into Unit 1 review for argument essays or quantitative analysis, feel free to share those at our Twitter hashtag. If you're looking for some writing skill tips, go to quill.org/AP. So again, if you have specific questions about today's Unit 5 review or the FRQs that I've posted at citizenu.org and Comparative Corner, feel free to use that hashtag. Otherwise, I will see you again tomorrow on Wednesday as we review Unit 1. Thank you again for tuning in to Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. Be well.